Perspectives, Finding Common Ground, a podcast series that brings together a panel of thought leader perspectives as a forum to socialize and problem solve education technology issues with the goal to ultimately find common ground.
Greetings and welcome to the premiere episode of Perspectives, Finding Common Ground. This episode will explore data privacy and security and who is really responsible for keeping the data safe. I'd like to begin with some introductions. On the panel will be Sarah Cluck. She is the Senior Director of Education Policy at SIIA. Also joining her is Lynn Heatherly. She is the Director of Product for Aries Software, a leading provider of student information systems. And Dr. Luis Valentino is the Superintendent of Coachella Valley Unified School District in California. I am Patrick Devanney, the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Partnerships at ClassLink and your host for today's conversation. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to start by kind of going around the horn, and I guess we'll start with Sarah and give her the opportunity to share a few thoughts of hers on the topic for today's conversation.
Sure, thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to join all of these really smart and bright and exciting panelists. Student data privacy it has been a topic of discussion and a hot topic for many years now. Student data privacy has been I work primarily with policymakers and education technology companies. SI is a trade association that represents education tech companies in front of Congress, state legislatures, and international policy-making bodies. So I work to help connect what's happening in the legislative bodies with our edtech companies so they can understand each other and hopefully make decisions that are deployable and functional in the real world. So student data privacy has been a topic that has been in the as part of the discussion since the 70s. The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, was one of our first federal privacy laws, and it has been updated through regulations ever since then. The most recent, I think, were 2011, the most recent regulations on the federal law. And over the past 10 years, dozens and dozens of state laws have passed on student data privacy and still being introduced today. I testified just yesterday in the state of Minnesota on a student data privacy law that they're considering. So there's stuff changing all the time in student data privacy, and best practices continue to change and update and get refined from the perspective of vendors, from the perspective of schools, to meet the expectations of their students and parents. Yeah, that's what I have for now. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I think next we'll bounce over to Lynn for a few opening comments, a little about her perspective.
Well, thank you for having me as well. I am excited about this conversation. I'm Lynn Heatherly, Director of Product for Aries Software. We are a student information system, so we are the primary student data management software for public schools. So we touch a lot of different types of users. We have people inputting data, from teachers to front office staff, people utilizing that data and then turning around and reporting it, often perhaps wanting to interact with other vendor software. And so student data privacy is a huge concern for us and something that we pay a lot of attention to and focus on. We obviously go to great lengths to protect the data that's in our system, the way it is stored and hosted on our system, the way it is extracted from our system for any kind of reporting or interoperability with other vendors. But we also want to be agents for advocacy, as Sarah was mentioning, with legislative bodies and so forth. We want to help guide the conversation toward requirements that make sense for keeping our students safe and their information safe. And not just students, but also staff data, because in a student information system, you've got personally identifiable data for your students as well as your school staff. And we want to make sure all of those are kept safe.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lynn. And finally, but not least, Luis, would you share some of your opening thoughts and perspective on the topic?
Sure, thank you, Patrick. It's a pleasure being with all of you, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this conversation. As the superintendent of a district in Southern California, the Coachella Valley Unified School District of 17,000 students, on paper, with another 600 doing virtual school and another 300 who have dropped off the map that we are seeking to find. We are the end users of most things technology. And so in a lot of ways, we are dependent on the policies that guide the do's and don'ts, that provide for opportunities for us to build out our curriculum, but also the work around our facilities and our budgets. How does the technology impact us? But more importantly, as we engage with it, how are we ensuring that we are following FERPA regulations or other regulations that require that we provide high levels of security for our students, our staffs at times, and even our community with information that may be important to provide, but we can't. And so in working with many of our partners, such as the other two guests, we oftentimes become reliant on their information, their ability to help us provide that level of security. And so it becomes really important when we do partner, when we purchase a product or a contract for a service, that we are working with someone who really takes security of information and the privacy that goes along with it very seriously. Because in the end, violating that level of security not only creates an environment of distrust, but there could be legal ramifications when we share some of that information. And so for us, it's a high priority to ensure that we protect our people and that we protect our staff's information.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for those thoughts. As I was listening to you make those comments, all of you initially, I came to the realization that maybe the way to start this discussion between us is how do we make people aware of data privacy and security? It's not like we grew up and had to take a course in it in school. And I think in many of our professional lives, we hear about it in the media, but we don't really know the origins or have a relationship with it kind of before we hear about it in the not so pleasant way. So maybe the place to start would be, maybe Lynn, you can talk a little bit about how does Aries, when you start working with a new client or you have a client that you're working with, how do you broach the topic of data privacy and security?
Sure. So one of the first steps when working with a new client is what we call implementation, getting their data loaded into our system, onboarding them. And typically our customers would be coming from another similar product. We have to extract data from that product and convert it, put it into our system. And so we have very specific guidelines around how we are willing to accept that data, making sure that they're not trying to send it to us in some sort of an insecure way. So we have pretty strict rules around how we get their data initially and put it into the system. Additionally, as our customers are going through the implementation process, they are simultaneously going through a training process. And of course, they're being trained on how to use the software. So we train a variety of types of users, but as part of that training, we also train them on best practices, which includes some of the data privacy issues that we're talking about. We also have very granular security in our system. So we work very closely with our school districts' security administrators on how to set up permissions for their users so that people don't have access in the system to data that does not need to be seen by them in their particular job role. And we can even control data security in many cases all the way down to the field level, so that particular fields can be protected and limit the number of people that have access to that information. So I would say it's a several pronged approach from the very beginning of our initial imports of their data all the way through training and best practices, as well as just securing the data from those who don't need to have access to it.
Great. It sounds like a real partnership. And I think we actually have the benefit, Luis, you actually use the Aries product in your district, correct?
Yes, we do, and it's a critical part of our work, because it allows for us to ensure that we are able to upload the necessary information that we need to have on everyone who works in our system. And also at the same time, we need to figure out how we protect the information so that it is made available to the individuals who need it in the way they need it. But oftentimes, because it's so easily accessible, more people feel that they should have access to it because it's not that important to protect it. And so being able to bring clarity to our staffs about how that information needs to be protected is a critical part of our professional development for all staff, which sometimes we don't think about. To have the opportunity to engage in conversation around safety and security around digital information, primarily because we are in an environment culturally where data is so readily available and accessible for people that they don't see how important it is to protect it. And in the end, we have breaches, because of that. It does not mean that folks don't care, but we become sort of immune to those conversations about protecting private student records, for example, adult records as well.
Yeah, and it seems we hear about it often with those breaches. You mentioned a breach. Somebody made a mistake, or there was a loophole that was missed, and oftentimes it's really hard to decipher what's fact and what, how real this breach is or how big it is. And sometimes media plays a role in this. And I think, Sarah, you might experience that quite a bit when you're talking to legislative bodies and working with them on policies. Sometimes there's influences or difficulties in figuring out what's actually true and what's not. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think when you're talking to policymakers or just the general public, I think people tend to conflate the news stories that they hear about the general consumer technology with education technology. And I think policymakers will look at what we hear about, and I'm not going to name names, but the big technology companies that have a lot of information on us, and we all scroll when we're sitting on our couch at night. I think it is, people tend to think that because that's technology, that's what's used in schools, but it's not. And I don't want to say it all the time, but it is, edtech can be pretty boring, in that it's really a lot of the budget software and information systems. And it's really cool in what it's able to do, in that it helps schools do things more quickly than they would have been able to do if the students' information was stored in an envelope, in a folder, in a cabinet. They're able to say, notice that a student has not showed up to one particular class in the day for 3 days in a row. Where is that student? That parent thinks that student's at home, at school. School didn't get a call from the parent saying that student's going to be absent. Where is that student? How do you intervene? You can connect with the parents right away. You may not have had that sort of quick turnaround without that technology. You may not have even noticed, because there's just so much going on in the school all the time, and there's just a lot happening, but being able to intervene and help find those students. I know Dr. Valentino said that you're trying to track down 300 students. There's a lot of schools and districts trying to track down students right now and identify where they went, and hopefully that technology can help them find that. But it's very different in the education technology world than it is in the like fun, cool, startup-y world that we all hear about and read about, getting all of these investments and making cool technology. There's cool stuff happening in edtech, but it's doing stuff to make the lives of Dr. Valentino and the teachers in that school district, their lives hopefully a little bit easier and making teaching a little bit more dynamic.
So sometimes I think some of what you're saying is that people perceive technology is the risk here. Because of technology, we are at risk. But I also would question, is that really the case? Could it be part of the solution?
I would say technology can absolutely be part of the solution. I also think that educating people on data stewardship is part of the solution. Many of the news stories we've seen over the last years are not related specifically to edtech data issues. Things like in Texas, there was a file folder found blowing in a field with papers that had student data on it blowing across a field. That's not a technology problem, that's a data steward problem. Somebody was not properly securing whatever they had. Should it have even been printed out? Why was it, how did it get out? Somebody's, laptop had data on it that it shouldn't have, that should have stayed inside a network. So things like that. So really educating people on when and where they can access this data, how it should be used is part of the issue. But also as vendors, we have a lot of tools available to us in terms of how we encrypt the data, firewalls and things that we have up to prevent any sort of inappropriate access. So it's definitely a partnership between having vendors who are really savvy in this area and taking care of the data, and school districts having a commitment to train their teams on the appropriate use of data and where it's stored and where it can be kept. So having those policies, and then even educating our students on not sharing their own information inappropriately. I think Dr. Valentino has some examples of that where students are just becoming immune to technology and not thinking through some of the risks of sharing information they share.
Thank you. And part of that also is, as students, as staff, and even as parents working with using our technology at home, we believe that it's IT's job to keep our information safe, and also the provider of that tool to keep us safe. And that as users, we should feel that we are in a bubble when we're using it, and no harm will come to us. But that's not the reality. And so to Lynn's point, being able to educate our students that in fact that's not the reality, our staff even that's not, because folks are, and also employees are so busy that we become dependent on others to take care of those things that we don't believe we should be responsible for. And so that's one more thing when we're talking to them about how to use a platform and keep it safe, and how to keep others away from that data while giving access to others that data. All of those things can become overwhelming. And so, as Lynn indicated, there are tools that our providers make available to us to make the end user feel that they can access the information safely by following a clear set of guidelines that are not overwhelming, but that allow for them to use the tool in a safe manner. That is really critical. In fact, when we're procuring, one of the things that we look for is ease of use, and the other one is ease of keeping the data safe, right? And that's really important to us because we don't have the knowledge base, the skill set, or the resources to be expanding the security for the tools that we're using.
Yeah, I was going to say that the talent and making sure that the vendors are supporting all of the schools that are their customers, because there is a diverse talent base at schools. You see some school districts with robust IT teams, and you see other school districts that have moved from 5-day weeks to 4-day weeks because that helps them save some money. And they might not have the IT staff to support what is needed to keep the information safe and secure. So figuring out, our member companies often will make sure that they need to make sure that, or all companies need to make sure that they are following best practices and all of the laws that are out there to match the expectations of what the school districts expect when it comes to keeping data private and secure. I have asked, when policymakers are writing laws and passing laws, I have suggested in some meetings that they put some money behind it and help schools hire staff to help implement these laws. And I haven't been successful in getting them to fund that yet. Maybe someday, but they tend to like to pass laws and the funding doesn't always follow those laws, unfortunately.
I have to imagine that not only, it's not a static question either. So certainly over the last 2 years with the pandemic that we've gone through, it's changed the way that businesses, that organizations operate and whatnot. But I have to think that there's also other changes. So this is a very dynamic situation, and the needs vary between organizations and vary over time. I also have to think that people's awareness of it changes and varies over time. Luis, do you have any examples of your staff or your students and how you see that happening?
Well, currently, for example, COVID-19, the pandemic has really thrown us for a loop in terms of data privacy, because we've had to balance between informing through contact tracing and providing that information to keep other people safe while protecting the rights of those individuals who have tested positive. And we've had, and because you have when you indicated, Patrick, that it is dynamic for us here in California, the rules kept changing on us, the guidelines and the criteria, and it kept evolving, and especially the first several months. And so as that stabilized, we settled in situations that were unclear, and oftentimes we were working without full information, and the technology was used to track information, but oftentimes it did not align with what the policy was. And so there was a misalignment between how we were supposed to use the technology, the kind of privacy it provided, and what the policy told us about how to use that technology and the privacy that it provided. So currently, we're still in the middle of that. When you think about February 15th for us in California and the removal of masks, you go online and the information isn't consistent, and so then the technology that will follow to support us in guiding that will probably not be consistent. And in terms of how we protect student information and staff information even. And so that is a concern for us, that oftentimes the policies do not align with the technology that we're using within that policy, or the expectation of that we follow a particular policy. And so then we're scrambling to find answers for things like that.
Right. Lynn, how do you juggle the changes at your organization?
So we have to have our eye on multiple compliance bodies to be monitoring what they're saying. Obviously, the federal government has some guidelines related to data privacy, and we have to comply with those. But then every state that we operate in can also have varying guidelines with regard to data privacy. And so we have to monitor each of those. And as the pandemic has unfolded, districts have had all kinds of needs, specifically with regard to contact tracing, also trying to identify and locate students, as Dr. Valentino mentioned, providing all sorts of varied instruction. And so as a SIS vendor, we have to be monitoring these legislative actions and Board of Education type actions and making sure that we comply quickly with what they're asking for. But to that point also, I would say that I really appreciate what Sarah does, and her work is so important, because it's also true as these states have different policies. Some of them have some pretty archaic policies that really seem to be exactly the opposite of what we're trying to achieve, as far as requiring certain types of student data, like social security numbers and things like that, being in places that, as a SIS vendor, we really don't believe they belong. And so, we like to help advocate as well as, complying. We also want to advocate for change where we think that things are not perhaps in alignment with what they should be.
Sarah, it sounds like policies are at the center of a lot of these issues, and they are also changing. What thoughts do you have, or guidance would you have for vendors and for school districts around how they can best understand and best influence policies, and making sure that they're based on accurate information and productive in what gets created?
Well, I mean, you opened the door for me to suggest that vendors join SIA. We are a member-based organization, so if companies would like to join SIA, they can just reach out to me. But I think, and same goes, there is a superintendent's association that is very active and engaged. And I think none of us will forget how fast things moved in March and April and May of 2020. Things were fast, it was intense, and everyone was just scrambling to get the information out there that people needed, and people were running into problems, and other people were needing to find solutions to those problems really quickly. And I think we're still in that rush. It's never going to be what that was. But I think we are seeing now that we are going to always need to be prepared, no matter what, for going remote. What's going to happen if the school district needs to go remote for a week? What's going to happen? How are we supporting the students? How are we making sure they can connect to the internet or have the devices that they need? Or how are we making sure we are keeping tabs on them so that we know how to find them when we need to find them? Those sort of discussions weren't happening in the same way prior to March 2020. So I think we're all more connected than we were in March of 2020 or before March of 2020. And I think we're all still figuring out how best to serve all of the needs of our diverse communities. And I think we're going to continue to refine that. But there's just a lot going on, and we all need to keep tabs on it and talk to each other and make sure we're supporting each other to put forward the best work that we can for the students that we serve.
But clearly, the change is a challenge, and I don't want to necessarily bring up bad examples, but I think there are probably examples when policies are not kept up to date, when they don't stay. And Lynn, I don't know if you have any examples of those that you've run into.
I do.
They certainly vary, but
I do. So kudos to the state of California for allowing SIS vendors to eliminate the collection of social security numbers on their students many years ago. And so that's been a really great thing. Just one less piece of data that we have to have that's, potentially disruptive if it leaks out, and the state of California eliminated that. The state of Texas has not, and actually still requires that to be printed on an official transcript. And that is one piece that we would really like to advocate for the state of Texas to eliminate. That requires the SIS vendors and certain other types of vendors to collect and store that data and then reproduce it on printed documents. And as I mentioned before, you can have as much cybersecurity as you want, But when you start printing things out on documents and having them out there, that's a whole lot harder to secure and to control what eyes are seeing that and where it goes. So we would really like to advocate for that to be updated. And we see some similar things in other states, and a lot of states are starting to actually explore parent rights as far as withholding data. And so that also presents challenges to vendors when parents can opt out of having certain data elements kept in a sys or shared in certain ways. So yeah, I would say that, as I mentioned before, since it varies from state to state, you do run into these somewhat outdated policies, some very new policies, and you've got to be nimble enough to adjust.
So Louise, how as a school district do you prepare for changes in policies? Eliminating a social security number that might have been something that you used in terms of identifying a student, not advocating that, of course, but and now all of a sudden it's no longer required. It could change your whole workflow. How did, are policies helpful, or do they sometimes feel like they're burdens?
Well, sometimes they are helpful, and we become dependent on that. It becomes our pattern to use certain data or data sets in a particular way to define certain things, to make certain decisions. When one of them is taken away, then we have to reset because all of a sudden not having the social security number means that we can no longer use it for the ID because it's no longer available when we're trying to print out IDs, and that and in lieu of, say, a student ID number, which we would have done that had we not had the opportunity of the social security number. So we have to then rethink how we're going to approach the use of data based on particular policies. And then sometimes the policy in itself is very frustrating because we sometimes don't feel that it was fully thought out. In other words, what are the consequences of changing this policy? Now, the one of the social security number I think is a good one, and the impact here in California in terms of addressing it is not tragic. It's workable. But sometimes the policy is so drastic that it causes both a financial burden as well as a workflow burden to folks, because now we have to figure out how we're going to navigate that in the middle of something else. And oftentimes that policy shift is in opposition to the philosophy of the community in which it exists, and we find ourselves in a very difficult position. The pandemic has proven that over and over again. We're depending on the community that we're in. The policy has a greater, lesser impact.
Well, and this goes back to your comment, Sarah, about funding. And when policies are made, there's consequences downstream, and schools have to adjust for it. Businesses also have to adjust for it. And it would seem like your advocacy is in the right space there. If we're going to require things change, we might need some money to help them change.
Hopefully, I mean, it would be nice if the folks were responsive and say, yes, we will fund that. But that's not the response that you usually get when you go in and say, can you fund some IT staff or something like that?
Right.
Yeah.
So policies clearly are an important part of this. They are hard to figure out on the front end and difficult to maintain because there are so many tentacles to them. Let's talk a little bit about the populations, and I don't. This should be a free-flowing conversation, so we'll bounce around a little bit. Populations have changed, and their perception of data and how it's used and what it's good for have changed. Luis, would you like to comment a little bit on students and how they, or students and teachers and parents, how are you hearing different messages from them today that you heard from them in the past about data?
So with students, it's just like with the adults, it's generational. One of the things that we're finding with the elementary school kids is, and the middle school kids, is the IDs and passwords are for gaming, right, and to access games. So they do share games, or they even share passcodes for platforms like Hulu or Netflix. So to them, sharing this, which is data that should be protected, and the policy on the platform says protected, people still do it. And so the level of importance they give to security is less than for older students, but the adults. And so it behooves us as adults to reiterate and make clear the importance of privacy protection of their data. But many of the platforms, the social media ones, they're not that great in helping with that either, and oftentimes work against what we're trying to do, which is what I think Sarah was alluding to a little while ago about how some of the companies, the organizations, do not work in concert with the policies or the laws that are designed to protect information. And so for our teachers, that we have, use policies, right? Technology use policies that have to include education components on how to store your data, what data to share, what data not to share with each other as teachers or as administrators, and then how to educate your students on the same things, on privacy protection and that sort of thing. And so it's difficult for us to navigate because the technology is moving faster than our own understanding of how best to keep data safe. And the policies don't shift with the evolving technologies, and sometimes we find ourselves behind the 8 ball, not being able to be effective in how we talk about privacy protection.
Lynn, do you struggle with staff at all, and change, is staff not understanding or not evolving with data privacy requirements and rules?
So staff at schools are trying to get their jobs done and trying to, do the best they can to serve their students and their, fellow staff members as efficiently and effectively as possible. And, you're always kind of walking a fine line between efficiency and safety, that kind of thing. And so they may not even be thinking. You can imagine gathering a stack of documents and setting them next to your desk to do your data entry, maybe enrollment forms that you've had parents physically bring in. And then you get distracted and you wander away and you don't think about the fact that you've got these, documents full of all sorts of data sitting right there. And it's typically not that school staff are not wanting to be safe. It's just, they're busy trying to get their jobs done and maybe not thinking about it. And so anytime we can automate these processes, like having online registration, online enrollment that's, through a secure portal, and maybe not making parents fill all this out on paper and bring it in, then we're kind of helping to eliminate some of those areas of vulnerability and just not creating those opportunities. So a lot of it is not intent. It's just, out of sight, out of mind, not thinking about what the implications of this might be. And to the points that we've made before, the students are almost numb to technology because that's all they've grown up with. And some of us that are a little bit older, maybe we're a little more naturally suspicious as we've watched it evolve. But it's really easy to talk to somebody about safety when you're talking about their physical safety. Don't touch a hot stove. But cybersecurity is less tangible, and sometimes that message is also harder to get across to students. It's harder to imagine what that danger is compared to something that's a very present danger like a hot stove. So there's that challenge as well, which is why I think education and talking about it even from when they're little bitty in schools is also helpful for the students.
And finally, Sarah, do you think that the policymakers are maturing in their interpretation of data privacy and security in education and what needs to be done?
I think there is people have very diverse perspectives as policymakers, and diverse backgrounds and diverse ages. So come from it at all different levels. But I do think, and I don't want to discount kids because they're pretty clever. And if they can figure out how to keep things private that they want to keep private, they will do it. And I think the discussions that teachers are having with them about keeping their information private or being safe online or cyberbullying are super important. And Lynn is right that those should happen from when they're little itty bitties, and they're conversations to have. I know that there's curriculum out there, but I think even just like as they're experiencing and being, we need to make sure that the internet is available to kids so they can learn how to be on it and learn how to exist in a world where the internet exists. We can't close it off to them, because that becomes problematic later on if they're just accessing it for the first time at 18 and they have never been on it before. That's problematic. We need to make sure that they're introduced to it in a safe manner so that they know how to exist and be in that world that we are all in right now, actually, virtually. So I think from the policymaker perspective, making sure policymakers are aware of how our students are learning how to be in the world, both digitally and physically, and making sure that that is in line with what what policymakers expect for our children.
Thank you. Very well said. I think that in kind of drawing this to a conclusion, I think that there are several kind of common themes that we talked about, things that are takeaways that really are common ground from the various perspectives that we're bringing together. The first one that I would highlight is that communication is key to this working. All parties need to be open to dialogue and interaction with the other parties in order to make it work. I think another point that comes out is that everyone is responsible for protecting personally identifiable information, is responsible for contributing to safeguarding this data in their respective role and in their respective contributions to the effort. Technology seems to be on both sides of this. It was talked a little bit about as the source of the problem, but it appears that it also has a lot of contributions to be made in the solutions to the problems and providing greater protection to this valuable data that needs to be protected. And finally, the regulations do play a key role, and it's important for everyone to find a vehicle that they can make contributions and they can have a voice in the creation and the ongoing maintenance of the policies. And that will be different for different parties, for different perspectives, but always important that those contributions have a voice and have a way to be heard and to be utilized or leveraged. Did I miss anything? Is there anything any final thought that anybody wants to contribute on the discussion today?
You're really good at summarizing.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad, and I'm glad there's a lot of rich stuff that we can continue to work on, and that's the objective of this podcast, is to find those things that are common, because we can put work into those, and we don't have to agree on everything, but we can still find things that we can make contributions and work together on. I want to thank you all for joining today, Lynn, Luis, and Sarah, particularly for this very rich and generous conversation. Our goal is to continue to socialize education-based interoperability issues and hopefully find some good common ground and make a difference as we operate together. ClassLink is proud to sponsor this meeting and be a place to facilitate these conversations. So we thank you so much for joining. Please look forward. You can see this particular discussion on the ClassLink Media Hub on YouTube. And you can also look forward to our next conversation on the topic of challenges of digital equity, which will be broadcast about a month after this one comes out. If you have thoughts that you want to share or feedback you'd like to provide, you're welcome to send that to perspectives@classlink.com. So thank you very much again for your attendance. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you for listening. ClassLink is proud to be the meeting place to facilitate these conversations. If you have a topic idea, send it to perspectives@classlink.com. To keep hearing our perspectives, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify and subscribe to us on YouTube.